Do you still remember them? The 25 black gay celebrities who died from HIV/AIDS? They were once the artists who ruled the stage, lit up the screen, and defined an era. But when the world discovered their diagnosis, many were cast aside, their brilliance dimmed not by talent, but by stigma. More than 700,000 people in the US have died from the disease, but in the 80s and 90s it didn't just steal lives, it erased names, shattered careers, and buried dreams. And for black gay men in entertainment, that erasure was even more brutal. One man gave us an anthem of freedom, making the whole world dance, yet when he died his body was hidden, his funeral stripped of any mention of AIDS, as if his truth had never existed. Another was Hollywood's ultimate leading man, the face of American masculinity, but when the disease took hold, the same people who once idolized him turned their backs, leaving him to die alone, with no hand to hold, no final goodbye. The greatest tragedy? They weren't just fighting a virus, they were battling rejection, prejudice, and a world determined to forget them. Today, we reclaim their stories. These 25 black gay celebrities lived boldly, created fearlessly, and left behind legacies that the world tried, but failed, to erase. Alvin Ailey. Alvin Ailey, the dance icon who carried a secret until his last breath. How does a man build a legacy so powerful, yet leave this world in silence? Ailey didn't just choreograph steps, he turned dance into storytelling, a living archive of Black America's pain, triumph, and soul. Through the Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater, he gave the world revelations. Not just a performance, but a spiritual awakening, a hymn of resilience, a testament to the healing power of art. But behind the elegance and brilliance stood a man trapped in fear. As a gay black man in the 1960s and 70s, he knew that living openly could destroy everything he built. Love was hidden in the shadows, guarded from a world quick to condemn. And in an era when safe-sex conversations were nearly non-existent, the dangers of fleeting encounters went unseen until it was too late. When HIV entered his body, the disease stole his strength but never his spirit. By the mid-1980s, AIDS was more than a death sentence, it was a scarlet letter. Ailey lost weight, his energy faded, yet he refused to surrender. He kept directing, kept creating, kept pushing dancers beyond their limits. Even as his body weakened, his art did not. In 1988, he could no longer hide. Hospitalized, he told colleagues he suffered from internal bleeding, terrified that the truth of AIDS would stain his legacy. On December 1, 1989, World AIDS Day, Alvin Ailey passed away. His obituaries never mentioned the disease. His family buried him with silence. Yet his art refused to die. Every time an Alvin Ailey dancer moves across the stage, his spirit rises again, untouched by stigma, unbroken by silence, immortal in motion. Kevin Peter Hall. Kevin Peter Hall was fighting a battle he never saw coming. Standing at a towering 7 feet 2 inches, he was Hollywood's go-to creature performer, the man behind the mask of the relentless predator. Inside that suffocating, heavy costume, it was Hall's movements that gave the alien hunter its eerie, lifelike presence. Yet off-screen, he was the complete opposite, gentle, soft-spoken, a man devoted to his craft, his family, and the art of storytelling. But fate can be cruel. In 1987, a car accident left Hall needing surgery, a routine procedure that required a blood transfusion. At the time, HIV screening for blood donations was still in its infancy. The blood he received was tainted. Hidden inside, it was a silent death sentence. For years, he had no idea. He kept working, kept thrilling audiences, unaware of the danger growing inside him. By 1990, while filming Predator 2, weakness began to creep in. At first, he blamed the grueling demands of his roles. But soon, the truth was undeniable. By early 1991, his body was failing. Knowing his time was short, Hall made his diagnosis public, not to seek pity, but to break the crushing stigma surrounding AIDS. Hollywood, however, wasn't ready. The calls stopped. The roles disappeared. The industry that once celebrated him now looked the other way. Through it all, his wife, actress Elena Reed Hall, never left his side. But the world moved on. On April 10, 1991, Kevin Peter Hall passed away. Not in battle, not in an on-screen fight, but from an enemy he never invited into his life. His death didn't make headlines. Hollywood let him fade into obscurity, just as it had with so many others. But legends don't die so easily. For every fan who still watches Predator, for every child who marvels at that towering alien figure on screen, Kevin Peter Hall lives on. A gentle giant, a true artist, forever standing tall, long after the curtain fell. Ron Vawter. Ron Vawter performed until his final breath. When death came knocking, he didn't retreat. He walked onto the stage, locked eyes with the audience, and kept going. He was never a Hollywood superstar, but in the world of experimental theater, Ron was a legend, a fearless artist who blurred the line between performance and reality. As a core member of the Wooster Group, he pushed boundaries, embodied controversial characters, and forced audiences to confront uncomfortable truths. But nothing was as daring as his last role. In the early 1980s, Ron contracted HIV, likely through unprotected encounters within the tight-knit theater community he called home, a world of boundless creativity where freedom and risk walked hand in hand, and caution was often left behind. As AIDS tore through the LGBTQ+ community, Ron watched friends vanish one by one. Then, it was his turn. By 1992, the disease was ravaging his body. His weight plummeted, his skin broke with lesions, yet he refused to step back. Instead, he wove AIDS into his art. On stage in Roy Cohn/Jack Smith, Ron portrayed Roy Cohn, a ruthless lawyer who persecuted LGBTQ+ people and later died of AIDS himself. It was a haunting irony, a dying man embodying the very figure who condemned men like him. By the final act, his hands trembled, his lesions glaring under the lights, and the audience sat in stunned silence as reality and fiction collided. Even as his strength faded, Ron kept touring. In 1993, he pushed himself across Europe, knowing it would be his last performance. On April 7, 1994, Ron Vawter passed away. Yet he never had a final curtain call, because in truth, he never left the stage. His story, his art, his courage still live on. Eazy-E. Eazy-E, the godfather of gangsta rap, was taken far too soon. Eric Wright, better known as Eazy-E, wasn't just another rapper. He was the architect of an entire movement, the mastermind who gave birth to NWA Fearless, Street Smart, and Business Savvy. He was the raw, unapologetic voice that blasted straight outta Compton into the world. To many, he seemed untouchable. But HIV doesn't care about fame, money, or power. 4 years, Eazy lived life in the fast lane. Cars, women, wild nights, and non-stop success. The rap game thrived on chaos, and he was right in the middle of it. What he didn't know was that one night, one encounter, would change his destiny forever. By early 1995, the unstoppable force of West Coast hip-hop could barely breathe. A cough turned deadly, and when doctors finally tested him, the truth hit like a bombshell. It wasn't pneumonia, it was AIDS. The world was stunned. A gangsta rap icon, diagnosed with a disease buried in stigma and silence. Fans whispered, critics speculated, and the hip-hop community was forced to face a reality it had long ignored. For a man who had built his life on bravado, Eazy-E's final days were different. Humbled, he used his last breath not to boast, but to warn, "Don't follow my path, learn from it." On March 26, 1995, at just 30 years old, Eazy-E passed away. No gunfire, no gang war, no rap beef, just a disease that did not discriminate. His death sent shockwaves through hip-hop. And yet, his voice never truly faded. Every time Boys in the Hood or Real Motherfuckin' G's blasts through the speakers, he's still there, a legend, a warning, and a pioneer who left too soon. Just as Rock Hudson's death forced Hollywood to confront AIDS, Eazy-E's passing forced hip-hop to face the same truth. A movement lost its godfather, but the world gained a cautionary tale etched in beats and memory. Rock Hudson. Rock Hudson was the very picture of Hollywood masculinity. Tall, handsome, effortlessly charming. In the 1950s and 60s, he was the ultimate leading man, a box office giant adored by women and bankrolled by studios. But behind that dazzling smile and larger-than-life presence, he was living a reality that wasn't truly his own. Hudson was a gay man in an industry that refused to accept him. His public image was carefully staged, glamorous dates with women, red carpet appearances, and a scripted persona designed to hide a truth Hollywood wouldn't forgive. He attended glittering parties, but his real love stories played out in secrecy. In an era when a single rumor could destroy a career, Rock Hudson's greatest role was the one in which he could never be himself. Then came AIDS. By the early 1980s, his body began to betray him. The weight loss, the relentless cough. At first, he brushed it off as aging. But when doctors confirmed the truth, it wasn't just a diagnosis, it was a death sentence. Hudson knew his time was short. Yet instead of fading quietly into the shadows, he made a choice that changed history. On July 5, 1985, he announced to the world that he had AIDS. The revelation sent shockwaves through Hollywood and beyond. Until that moment, AIDS was whispered about as a gay disease, something hidden in the shadows. After Hudson, the world was forced to pay attention. On October 2, 1985, Rock Hudson passed away. But his legacy didn't vanish with him. He became the first major face of the AIDS crisis, shattering stigma, forcing society to confront the disease, and compelling Hollywood to change. His courage turned personal tragedy into a public awakening, one that forever altered the conversation around AIDS. Essex Hemphill. Essex Hemphill, the poet who refused to be silenced. His words were his weapon. His poetry was raw, unapologetic, urgent, a voice for black gay men erased from history during the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s. While white men became the public face of the crisis, black men were dying too, and no one was telling their stories. Society ignored them. The healthcare system failed them. History tried to erase them. But Hemphill wouldn't let that happen. Through his poetry, he gave voice to desire, pain, and rage, the helplessness of watching an entire generation vanish. He wrote about love and sex, about the risks black gay men faced in a world that didn't care whether they lived or died. He made the invisible visible. Then the disease came for him. By the early 90s, Hemphill felt the shift, the exhaustion, the weight loss, the slow creeping decline. For years he had written about it. Now it was his own story. And still, he kept writing, kept speaking, kept fighting. On November 4, 1995, at just 38 years old, Essex Hemphill passed away. But he was never erased. Every time his poetry is read, every time a Black LGBTQ+ voice rises, he is still there. Because Essex Hemphill wasn't just a poet. He was, and remains, a revolution. Willie Smith. Willie Smith wasn't just a designer. He was a revolution. Long before streetwear became a buzzword, he was already living it, turning sidewalks into runways and everyday people into style icons. In the 1980s, when high fashion built walls of exclusivity, Smith tore them down. His clothes were bold, fresh, unapologetically stylish, proof that fashion didn't need velvet ropes to be powerful. But behind the brilliance was a man walking a tightrope between acceptance and rejection. As a black gay designer, he pushed boundaries with more creative freedom than most, yet freedom never meant immunity. The AIDS epidemic was merciless, and in the nightlife he loved, filled with wild parties and moments of reckless liberation, he unknowingly stepped into its grip. By 1986, the warning signs hit hard. A sudden bout of pneumonia landed him in the hospital, only to discover it was just a symptom of something far more devastating. Willie knew the truth, and he also knew the fashion world's cruelty. If they discovered he had AIDS, the same industry that applauded him would erase him. So he made a haunting choice. He would carry the secret to his grave. On April 17, 1987, Willie Smith died at just 39 years old. His obituary never mentioned AIDS. No speeches honored his fight. No fashion houses lifted his name in tribute. The man who redefined style was buried in silence, just as he had feared. Reggie White. Reggie White, the devout NFL legend whose AIDS diagnosis stunned the nation. He wasn't just a football player, he was a force of nature. Known as the Minister of Defense, White dominated the field with raw power and unshakable faith, balancing his ferocity as a competitor with his calling as a preacher. America revered him not only for his talent, but for the unwavering principles he lived by. He stood as a symbol of strength, discipline, and morality. So when the shocking news broke that Reggie White had been diagnosed with AIDS, the country was floored. How could this happen to a man of such faith? A role model, a man of God. In the 1990s, AIDS carried a stigma of scandal and shame. Rumors spread like wildfire, and people assumed the worst. But the truth was far more complicated. White hadn't contracted the virus through reckless choices. It may have been from a medical procedure, a tragic and unforeseen exposure. Back then, AIDS wasn't only a death sentence, it was a mark of disgrace, one that could shatter even the most sterling reputation. Yet Reggie White refused to be defined by the illness. He never asked for pity. He never let the world see him as a victim. But as his once indomitable body weakened, the fight became impossible to hide. On December 26, 2004, at just 43 years old, Reggie White passed away. His death sent shockwaves through the sports world and beyond, forcing a painful reckoning. HIV and AIDS did not discriminate. They didn't care about race, religion, or reputation. This was not just a gay disease or the result of immorality, it was a global crisis. Reggie White's death was more than a tragedy. It was a wake-up call. Even the strongest, most respected figures weren't immune. And it was time for the world to stop looking away. Billy Wright. Billy Wright, the forgotten spark of rock and roll, a pioneer erased too soon by AIDS. In the 1950s, his voice was thunder, his stage presence electric, his slick hair and flamboyant suits a blueprint that future legends like Little Richard would follow. Wright wasn't just a performer, he was a black, openly gay man in an era when being either was dangerous, and being both was revolutionary. While others hid in the shadows, he stepped into the light, unapologetic, unafraid, and unwilling to conform. But the industry wasn't ready for a man like him. His charisma, his power, his star quality, everything said, superstar, yet prejudice kept him at arm's length. As rock and roll exploded, Wright was quietly pushed aside, his name fading even as others built empires on the foundation he had laid. By the 1980s, another storm hit, the AIDS crisis. Stigma was as deadly as the disease itself. No one knows when Wright contracted HIV, but his health declined, and with it, the spotlight dimmed. Alone, he fought his battle in silence. On October 28, 1991, at just 59 years old, Billy Wright was gone. No headlines. No tributes. No fanfare. A voice that helped give birth to rock and roll was silenced. Not because he lacked talent, but because he dared to live free. Max Robinson. Max Robinson, the trailblazing anchor silenced by AIDS. He wasn't just reading the news. He was rewriting history. In a world of white faces dominating America's television screens, Robinson broke through as the first black journalist to anchor a national broadcast. Every night, his calm authority told viewers that black voices deserved to be heard. But behind the suit, the smile, and the sharp delivery, he carried a secret the world wasn't ready for. Robinson wasn't just fighting racism in the newsroom. He was suffocating under the unbearable weight of being the first. Every gesture was examined, every word dissected. Failure wasn't an option, because the system was waiting for it. The pressure pushed him toward alcohol and hidden relationships, brief escapes from a reality that never released its grip. Somewhere along the way, he contracted HIV. He never said when, never admitted it aloud. As his health crumbled, he worked tirelessly, terrified that 3 letters, AIDS, could erase everything he had built. On December 20, 1988, Max Robinson died at just 49 years old. The industry he transformed barely paused to acknowledge his passing. The cause of death was whispered but never spoken, as if silence could erase the truth. He had paved the way for generations of black journalists, yet in the end, he still had to hide from the very society he helped change. And he was not alone. Singer Jermaine Stewart, too, carried the same secret, his voice silenced by the same cruel fate. Jermaine Stewart. Jermaine Stewart had the world dancing with "We Don't Have to Take Our Clothes Off," an anthem that celebrated love beyond physical desire. But behind the upbeat lyrics and joyful rhythm was a heartbreaking irony. While fans embraced the song's message, Stewart was secretly fighting a disease that was devastating an entire generation of queer men. In the 1980s, an HIV diagnosis wasn't just a death sentence, it was social exile. Though Stewart never publicly came out, his sexuality was an open secret in the music industry. Between late nights, fleeting relationships, and the unspoken dangers of the era, he unknowingly stepped into a battle he could never win. As the illness took hold, Stewart slowly withdrew from the spotlight. He knew that if the truth ever surfaced, his career would vanish long before the disease claimed him. Friends noticed the changes, the weight loss, the exhaustion, the fading strength of his once electric voice. But when they asked, he only smiled, determined to keep up the illusion of the carefree pop star. Even in the hospital, he clung to his privacy, never admitting what was happening. In his final days, Stewart made sure the world would remember him the way he had always appeared, vibrant, joyful, untouchable. On March 17, 1997, Jermaine Stewart passed away at just 39 years old. No public statements, no grand farewell, only silence. He had spent his life singing about freedom, yet in the end, he remained a prisoner of the stigma of his time. Kenny Green. Kenny Green, the golden voice of R&B, and the man whose final confession came too late. His voice could move millions, yet no one ever truly heard his silent cry for help. As the lead singer of Intro, the 90s group behind soulful ballads like Come Inside and their rendition of Ribbon in the Sky, Kenny poured love, passion, and longing into every note. But behind that velvet sound lived a truth he could never share openly. In the hypermasculine world of R&B, where black men were expected to be tough, dominant, and straight, Kenny's identity as a bisexual man was a secret locked in chains. He moved through relationships like a shadow, never knowing that one of them would seal his fate. By the late 90s, his body began to betray him. The soaring high notes became harder to reach, every performance left him drained, the fevers, the relentless cough. Deep down, Kenny knew what was happening long before the doctors confirmed it. And when the truth could no longer be hidden, he did what he had spent a lifetime avoiding. He confessed. He admitted he was HIV positive. He admitted he was bisexual. But by the time he found the courage to live authentically, it was too late to change the ending. On October 9, 2001, at just 32 years old, Kenny Green passed away. He had spent his short life singing about love, yet in the end, the world never loved him back the way he deserved. Brad Davis. Brad Davis, the Hollywood star who chose death over AIDS. How does a Golden Globe-winning actor simply vanish into silence? In 1978, Brad Davis electrified audiences with his raw, unforgettable performance in Midnight Express. That role catapulted him to international fame and placed him among Hollywood's elite. Yet, even at the height of success, Davis knew the brutal truth. In Hollywood, there was no room for weakness, and certainly not for a man fighting AIDS. A straight man, Davis never imagined he would become the face of a disease drenched in stigma. Years of surgeries and prescription drug use led to an accidental infection, a cruel twist of fate in an era when an HIV diagnosis was not just a death sentence for the body, but for a career, a reputation, a life. As the illness took hold, his once striking face hollowed, his body withered, his strength drained away. The physical agony was unbearable, but the silence from Hollywood cut even deeper. Friends stopped calling, roles disappeared, the industry he had given everything to erased him as if he had never existed. Refusing to let the disease define him, Davis made a final, defiant choice. On September 8, 1991, he ended his life with assisted medication, dying in his wife's arms, not as a fading star, but as a man in control of his fate. Hollywood may have turned its back on him, but his performances endure. Though his name is rarely spoken, his story remains, a testament to defiance, and to the courage of refusing to be erased. Craig Garrison. Craig Garrison, the fearless theater actor who brought HIV to the stage. At a time when being openly gay and HIV positive could end a career, Garrison stood unshaken. He wasn't a Hollywood star, but in the world of experimental theater, he was a flame that refused to burn out. He refused to let his diagnosis silence him. Instead, he wove his illness into his art, turning pain into performance and struggle into storytelling. Even as lesions spread across his skin and his voice weakened, he kept stepping into the spotlight, daring the world not to look away. He became a living testament to resilience, proving that while his body faltered, his spirit never did. In his final days, frail and barely able to move, surrender was still unthinkable. When he could no longer stand, he wheeled himself onto the stage, determined to perform one last time. Only when every ounce of strength was gone did he allow his friends to carry him back to bed. On December 14, 1992, Craig Garrison passed away. But he didn't die in a hospital bed. He died on stage, in the hearts of those who witnessed his fearless artistry and his unbreakable fight. And then, there was Michael Jeter, the beloved Green Mile star who faced HIV not with despair, but with a smile. Who could have imagined that a man who brought so much joy to the world would one day be claimed by such a merciless disease? Fela Anikulapo Kuti. Fela Anikulapo Kuti may have left this world at just 58, but his music, his message, and his fight still thunder on. He was a legend, a warrior, a voice that can never be silenced. And then there was Merritt Buttrick, a rising star in the Star Trek universe, full of promise and raw talent. His career was only beginning to bloom when fate delivered its cruelest blow. As the HIV/AIDS epidemic tore through Hollywood, Merritt became one of its tragic casualties. He never spoke publicly about his sexuality, but whispers of secret romances and wild late-night parties hinted at a life far more layered than the public ever knew. In his final days, the disease ravaged his body, stripping away the vibrant spirit fans once adored. Too proud to let friends see him in such a frail state, he withdrew into isolation. On March 17, 1989, at only 29 years old, Merritt Buttrick's light was extinguished far too soon. Merritt Buttrick's life ended far too soon, claimed by an illness that carried heavy stigma in its time. Yet for Star Trek fans, he will always live on. As David Marcus, the son of a legend, he carved a place in the hearts of millions. Though his light faded too early, his spirit never dimmed. On screen, he was immortal, and in memory, his legacy continues to shine. Arthur Ashe. Arthur Ashe wasn't just a tennis champion. He was a warrior who fought battles far greater than the ones on the court. The first black man to conquer Wimbledon, the US Open, and the Australian Open, Ashe carried not only a racket but also the weight of breaking barriers, challenging racism, and inspiring equality everywhere he played. But his fiercest opponent was one he never saw coming. In 1983, after undergoing heart surgery, Ashe received a blood transfusion contaminated with HIV. It wasn't the result of reckless living, but of a tragic medical mistake. At first, he kept the diagnosis private, knowing the world wasn't ready to understand. Yet when the truth emerged, Ashe refused to hide. He spoke out, educating millions, fighting stigma, and turning his pain into purpose. Even in his final days, he stood as a symbol of courage and dignity. He left behind more than trophies and records. He left wisdom, resilience, and a legacy of hope, especially for his daughter. On February 6, 1993, at just 49 years old, Arthur Ashe took his last breath. He may have lost his final match, but in the greater game of life, he claimed victory, one of strength, integrity, and an impact that still echoes across generations. Joe Higgs. Joe Higgs, the forgotten father of reggae. He shaped the very heartbeat of the genre, mentoring legends like Bob Marley and Peter Tosh, laying down the foundation for reggae's global rise. Yet while his students became icons, Higgs was left in the shadows, overlooked by the very industry he helped build. Living the free-spirited life of a true reggae musician, he never saw the danger that lurked. Like so many of his generation, he became vulnerable to the virus that swept through the community. By the late 1980s, his health had begun to fail. But in Jamaica, where stigma ran deep, Higgs was forced into exile in the United States. There, broke and unable to afford treatment, he faded quietly from the world. On December 18, 1999, at just 59 years old, he died alone and uncelebrated. The world may have forgotten his name, but his legacy is eternal. Every rhythm, every melody that pulses through reggae today carries a piece of Joe Higgs, the unsung architect of a sound that will never die. Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn, the ruthless enforcer who built his empire on fear and hypocrisy. He made his name by persecuting gay men, masterminding the infamous McCarthy-era witch hunts with cold precision. Yet behind the closed doors of Washington's darkest circles, Cohn lived the very life he condemned. Reckless encounters eventually caught up with him. In 1984, doctors confirmed the truth. He had AIDS. Still, Cohn denied it to the bitter end, insisting it was liver cancer, even as his body withered away. Obsessed with clinging to power, he fought to keep his status intact. But by 1986, stripped of his license, abandoned by allies, and shunned by the world, he died at just 59. No tributes. No mourning. Only the cruel irony of a man destroyed by the very disease he had used to vilify others. Assata Saint. Assata Saint, the poet who fought death with nothing but words. Born in Haiti, Saint refused to be erased in the 1980s, a time when an HIV diagnosis was considered a death sentence. He stood unflinching, boldly declaring himself both gay and HIV positive. For him, poetry was not just art, it was survival. He never knew when the virus entered his bloodstream, but as friends vanished one by one, he understood his own time was slipping away. Still, he kept writing, his voice rising against the silence, a beacon for a generation that refused to fade quietly. On June 29, 1994, at just 36 years old, Asato Saint passed. Yet his words live on, immortal, defiant, proof that art can outlast oblivion. Then there was Jean Anthony Ray, the dancer whose flame burned too fast. In Fame, 1980, he was pure electricity, a whirlwind of movement that left audiences breathless. But behind the dazzling performances was a man consumed by Hollywood's fast lane, drugs, wild nights, and reckless choices pulling him into a downward spiral. By the 1990s, he had contracted HIV, and as his health declined, the industry that once adored him turned its back. The star who once commanded the screen could barely stand. On November 14, 2003, at only 41, Jean Anthony Ray's light went out. But the memory of his fire, the raw defiance in every step, still lingers, reminding us of both the brilliance and the fragility of life lived on the edge. Jean Anthony Ray. Jean Anthony Ray took his final bow, leaving behind not just an empty stage, but a legacy of brilliance, and a dance that would never be finished. And then there was Ari Zayn, a choreographer who didn't just teach movement, he was movement itself. Ari shattered barriers of race, sexuality, and artistry, redefining what contemporary dance could be. But as the HIV/AIDS crisis swept mercilessly through the artistic world, claiming some of its brightest stars, Ari knew his time was slipping away. Diagnosed in 1986, he refused to surrender. Even when his body grew frail, his spirit burned unshakable. Too weak to dance, he directed from a chair, determined that his vision would outlive him. On March 30, 1988, at just 39 years old, he took his last bow. Yet his story didn't end with silence. His movements ripple through dancers today, a reminder that the epidemic stole not just lives, it stole dreams, dignity, and the legacies of artists who deserve to be celebrated, not erased. When the world turned its back, it forced them into silence. But today, we refuse to let their voices fade. They were more than names in a history book. They were creators, lovers, fighters, people who gave everything until their final breath. If their stories move you, share this. Let future generations remember not only the tragedy of AIDS, but the brilliance of those who lived, created, and loved through it. Their names deserve to be remembered forever. And for more powerful stories from the world of entertainment, Hollywood drama, iconic moments, and untold truths, don't forget to subscribe. Your support means the world to us. Stay tuned, because their stories live on through us.